Well, welcome everybody to this webinar where we are honored to have Susan Shirk and Rana Mitter and to talk about her recent book, Overreach. And perhaps just a few words about the book that she has written as we start. Susan shows in this illuminating, disturbing and utterly persuasive new book it is written that something changed. China went from fragile superpower to global heavyweight, threatening Taiwan as well as its neighbors in the South China Sea and tightening its grip on Hong Kong, and openly challenging the United States for preeminence, not just economically and technologically, but militarily. China began to overreach. Combining her decades of research and experience, Susan Shirk, one of the world's most respected experts on Chinese politics, argues that we are now fully controlled in a new Cold War. So a little bit about Susan and her background. She is research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and is the author of China, Fragile Superpower and the Political Logic of Economic Reform. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. And Rana is director of the University China Center and professor of the history and politics of modern China and a fellow of St. Cross College at the University of Oxford. He's a great expert on Asia and China and is the author of several books, including Modern China, A Very Short Introduction, and the award-winning A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World. So today, as the President of France and of the European Community visit China, it's an extremely appropriate moment to focus on what Susan has written and to discuss it. So Susan, I wonder if, thanking you for being with us, we could start off with you answering the question of why you wrote the book and what it principally contains. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Roddy, for giving me this opportunity to speak about my book with you, with Rana Mitter, and the other audiences at the Asia Scotland Institute. I had hoped to be there in person, and I hope to still have the opportunity in the future. Well, it was the mid-2000s when around 2006, 7, 8, and I noticed that China's actions, China's style of behavior, both internationally and domestically, had changed in very significant ways. For most of my career studying China, most of my life studying China, and I started in the 1960s, and had the opportunity to visit China in 1971. But then when China introduced reforms after Mao died, for most of that period studying China, it's really been a very positive experience because people's lives in China were improving. Of course, living standards were improving because of the market reforms, but also in terms of personal freedom, the ability to choose where you lived, what kind of work you did. China was not becoming a democracy as we know it in the West, but it was definitely becoming a freer society. And with access to information from abroad, people were traveling abroad, and China's relations with the United States and other countries were really not all that bad. Of course, there were still many differences in our political systems, and China very much was a rising power, so that the gap in power between China and the United States was narrowing somewhat, but even despite that, the policymakers and diplomats in the United States and China managed their relations quite well. And I credit China's diplomats as well as those in Washington and in other Western capitals. So, you know, so the whole experience of being a China scholar was a very happy, fortunate kind of thing. But then in the mid-2000s, things took a marked change. And internationally, I saw this primarily in the South China Sea, where after decades of working pretty well with other countries to manage relations, even though China, as well as Southeast Asian countries, had conflicting claims to the South China Sea and to the land features, the little islands and rocks within it. They managed to not to engage violently, with a few important exceptions, one in 1974 with Vietnam. But by and large, the South China Sea was not the focal point of popular nationalism. And, you know, China managed relations with other countries pretty well, putting good relations with its neighbors ahead of its sovereignty claims. But that changed around 2006 or 7, and there started to be a lot of jostling and confrontations, not just of other Southeast Asian claimants like the Philippines and Vietnam, but even of US naval vessels traveling through the South China Sea and doing surveillance activities. Also domestically, what we saw before the Beijing Olympics in 2008 was a tightening up of social control and control over the media and the internet. And I thought at the time, well, this is typical in China before major events like the Olympics. They tighten up social control over information to make sure there are no unexpected surprises. But then after the events, they loosen up and things go back to normal. But in this case, they didn't loosen up. So what I saw was a real change in China's behavior. I was puzzled by it, and I started my research to try to figure out what was going on.
And the reaction to the things that you wrote from those in China who read it, what has that been?
What do you mean the reaction? You mean the reaction of foreigners or the reactions of people in China?
No, the reactions of people in China.
Oh, to my book? Or
Yes.
Oh, I see. Well, first of all, I doubt that there probably are not many people in China who've had the opportunity to read my book. Yeah. It's only been out, you know, about 6 months or less. And it's not been translated into Chinese. I doubt that it will ever be published inside China because it deals with very sensitive topics related to political power and leadership. The book is based largely on my interviews with people in China because I've been studying China so long, going there for so many years, and had the opportunity to serve in government. I've had the opportunity to gain access to a lot of kind of political insiders whom I've been able to interview. And, you know, that's really a great advantage. And I wanted to use that advantage to help all of us better understand what Chinese politics is like inside the black box.
And so externally, what about the impact of China's overreach on its relationships with other countries, particularly the United States?
Well, of course, the meaning of overreach is to take things too far, to do things in an exaggerated manner in a way that then snaps back to harm yourself. So what I mean by overreach is in foreign policy, being too aggressive and provoking fights with your neighbors and with other countries, the United States in particular. And the reaction there has been a major international backlash. And you see the United States, European countries, Japan, Korea, many other Asian countries, Australia, joining in coalitions to balance against China, as it appears to be more threatening than in the past. So China is kind of engaged in overreach, which results in a kind of self-encirclement. Right now, the Chinese leaders complain that the United States and other countries are imposing policies to contain China, to stop it from developing. And to a certain extent, that's correct. And it's because of China's behavior, which appears to be more threatening to other countries. And of course, it's domestic extreme repressiveness internally, including the thought reform camps in Xinjiang, the sudden takeover by Beijing of Hong Kong, as well as other measures to control the population, surveillance, this kind of thing. This also increases the threat perceptions of countries outside of China.
Thank you. Well, we're very fortunate to have Rana Mitter with us, and I'm going to ask Rana now if he'd like to engage with some points that he will raise. And in the meanwhile, people listening, please use the chat or the Q&A function to write down any questions you might have as they occur to you, which we will deal with later on. Rana.
Ronnie, thanks very much. And I should say that I've been having the pleasure and privilege of conversations with Susan for years now, and it's a real pleasure, even though it's in virtual form, to be able to pick up that conversation as well. And also to say how much I've enjoyed this book, and do go out and order your copy on Amazon, or go to a good bookstore, or even not so good bookstore. I'm sure any of them will be happy to get you a copy. It's a very, very useful primer to what is happening right now in China and how we got there. I'd like to take a few of the themes from the book, Susan, and in a sense get your take not only on, as you've expressed them in the book, but also almost on the way that things have moved on in the few months since it went to press. One of the dangers of writing a book about contemporary China, as you know, is that events on the ground seem to move faster than any of us who write about it can keep up. One of the reasons I'm glad, in one sense, I'm a historian, since we get a little bit of a longer lead time in terms of some of what we do. But let me start with someone who sits really centrally in your book, and that is inevitably Xi Jinping. And a lot of outside commentary, not necessarily from China specialists, does spend a lot of time centering and concentrating on Xi Jinping. I sometimes find myself wondering whether that's because he's a personality, he's one individual, he's sort of easier for the outside world to grasp as, you know, the strong man. You use that expression in your book, actually, strong man who's come to power. Whereas you, of course, know that the whole system that sits behind him also has its own complexities. So I guess the question is, how important do you think Xi Jinping is in terms of understanding that turn towards overreach that you analyze in the book?
Well, thanks so much, Rana, for that question. And it's great to have a chance to talk with you, continue our conversation. Well, one of the surprising points that I make in my book, and that I discovered in the process of doing the research for it, is that this pattern of behavior that I call overreach doesn't start with Xi Jinping. So we really can't blame him for turning China into a threat. whereas before it was not a threat. So that's overly simplified view. And what's surprising is that the collective leadership of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao that preceded Xi in the previous decade, things started to go wrong then. And so I have really quite a lot of analysis there of how collective leadership tended toward overreach. But then at the end of that decade, one of the big problems was that the system of collective leadership, this oligarchy, was very, very corrupt. So it gave Xi Jinping the opportunity to make the case for a more centralized, personalistic leadership. And he carried out an anti-corruption campaign, which in addition to going after the real problems of corruption, was a purge of potential rivals to Xi Jinping himself. And this purge continues to this very day. In fact, just in recent days, we've seen the most senior financial official ever been targeted by the purge. And Xi Jinping right now is going through the banking and financial system, getting rid of all the people that are more technocratic, less compliant to him. And so this purge has put tremendous pressure on officialdom. So as you point out, the problem is not just Xi Jinping's personal ambitions or his personality or his commitment to Marxism-Leninist ideology, but really the kind of system that he has structured in which there's so much top-down pressure. People, all the officials are living in a climate of fear that they could be targeted by this purge. And therefore, they jump on the bandwagon behind Xi Jinping's policies as early as they can to demonstrate their loyalty to him. And this tends to require them to implement his policies in a more extreme version than he himself may have originally wanted. So that's really one of the important drivers of overreach. And then nobody dares report up the ladder to him to tell him the real costs of the policies that he's pursuing. So this has some very unfortunate similarities to the type of system that Mao Zedong operated with. And, you know, Deng Xiaoping, after Mao died, and Deng tried to institutionalize a more regular collective leadership, he argued that the problem with Mao was this over-concentration of authority. And that's really exactly what we have today, is over-concentration of authority, which, as Deng said, leads to arbitrary decision-making, no checks and balances. And so we get a lot of policy mistakes that are costly to China. And that's the dynamic driving overreach today.
So let's drill down a bit into that, Susan. It's a really exciting and interesting set of points, if somewhat alarming in some ways. Let's talk about ideology, because that's another term that comes up quite a bit in your book. And for a long time, there was conventional wisdom. I think China analysts like you would never have, bought it wholesale, but just characterizing it very crudely. For a long time, era of Mao, you had this highly ideological period, and then you have a period of pragmatism is the word that's often used, you know, that Deng Xiaoping wasn't really a proper communist. He preached communism, but actually practiced capitalism, all these sorts of ideas. And it made a lot of people, not least actually investors from the Western world, think, well, actually China's turning into this, you know, this capitalist country that's a little bit similar to what we see elsewhere in the world. And then they get blindsided when actually there is a real sense, particularly in the last few years, that there is an ideological agenda. But if there is, one of the things that's fascinated me is trying to work out what it might actually be, because within the language that's used, you find some things that come straight out of the Marxist-Leninist playbook, and Xi Jinping himself calls himself a 21st century Marxist. But there's a new interest in going back to Chinese thinking, pre-modern philosophical thinking, in a way that Mao would never have done. He rejected that Confucian past, but actually today's Communist Party rather wants to adapt it. And then a document like the statement on the party's history issued in November 2021, a relatively rare, big ideological statement. This is only the third one actually in 70 years. All of this suggests that the party is trying to do something with or about ideology, but it's not quite clear to me what it is they want to do and where they want to go. What do you think the importance, if anything, of ideology is, and what does it mean in the 2020s for China?
Well, that is really a puzzling question. I mean, I wondered this frequently when at the street corner, I see some party document filled with a lot of, which, you know, sounds to us like ideological gobbledygook, you know, phrases that don't seem to have that much meaning. And I think, do really the people in this neighborhood, do they really care about what's there? Or is that the way that the local party official is trying to demonstrate his or her loyalty, you know, to show, is this a performance basically by subordinates to the leaders? You know, it's hard for me to see that the Chinese urban middle class really finds much appeal in party ideology nowadays. You know, and certainly I believe that the urban middle class, these are people who are keen to get their kids well educated, so they might go abroad to school. They want them to learn foreign languages. And now they find in school they have more class time on political ideology. You know, is this really appealing to the urban middle class? It's hard for me to see that it is. And it seems like more of an inside game of officials and people in the system. I think the ideals that really matter to ordinary people in the society are more nationalist ones. You know, they're proud of their country. They resent it if the United States imposes sanctions or criticizes their country. I think nationalism has a lot more sway, and certainly part of Xi Jinping's kind of portfolio of ideas, ideological ideas that he floats out on appropriate occasions. But I don't think most of party ideology itself has much appeal to people outside the political system.
It becomes quite an abstruse sort of thing. Well, you mentioned nationalism, and let's use that as a way to talk a little bit about some, I think, of the most pressing issues that I think a lot of people observing China are wondering about at the moment, and which again come very much from the themes that are in your book. So let's bring up the T word, Taiwan, because I know it's on a lot of people's minds. Let me put to you two scenarios which I hear a lot, but which strike me as being impossible to reconcile with each other beyond a short time. And I'm wondering whether it's a kind of dichotomy that you'd even, you know, accept or analyze. Let me tell you what they are. So one version is, so China only came out of COVID regulations just, it seems like a million years ago, but actually it was, you know, only 5 months. It was actually very, very recent in absolute terms. and has been, going in absolutely the reverse direction. The economic numbers are going up, housing starts, purchase and managing indexes, all the things that people look at to try and work out whether the economy is really moving towards that 5% target, which they put forward at the Lianghui, the 2 meetings, which happened just a month or so ago. Now, with that scenario saying the most important thing for this year, for next year, maybe for the next 5 years at least, is for China to get its mojo back, to use a technical term, when it comes to the economics. In other words, that they need to solve youth unemployment. They need to deal with the horrible demographic crisis that means that pensions and healthcare need to be provided for an aging population. They need the small and medium enterprises in China to be kickstarted again and start to get that, economic growth machine going. It won't be the 1980s again, but it will at least show that there's juice in the economy. And to do all those things, they need one other thing that is a very constant part of your book, and that is stability. You talk about Weiwen, the maintenance of stability, is a great Chinese term. And in other words, not launching anything that might lead to a serious confrontation that, whatever the other results, would certainly destabilize the Chinese economy and the global economy, but the Chinese economy very seriously. So that's one side. But the other side says, well, hang on, Taiwan is very, very important to Xi Jinping, to the wider Chinese political system, to people who have a nationalistic feeling. This is unfinished business from 1949, more than nearly 8 decades in which the island has not been brought back. And as you pointed out already, there's a kind of quite heavy ideological tint in the way that the leadership is being reshaped. So maybe in that scenario, the economy perhaps just going horribly wrong for a while. It's a price worth paying in terms of that nationalist goal of somehow incorporating Taiwan back into the mainland, which certainly has been very clearly stated by the leadership as a goal for some time in the future. There's no precise date on that, but at the same time, it's clear that it's not off the agenda at all. And yet that, of course, would be inevitably very damaging to that already somewhat bruised economy in China. So is that a fair dichotomy in terms of policymaking from the Chinese side on Taiwan? If so, which way do you think it might go? And if I've been unfair, how would it be better to characterize it?
Well, no, I think your question is really, China has daunting domestic problems, especially economic problems, which of course are related to social stability as well. But it has daunting problems. So how do those daunting problems influence its policies toward Taiwan? Do they make them more cautious, try to stabilize the situation with Taiwan so that it won't disrupt the focus on domestic problems? Or do you get what international relations experts call diversionary war or diversionary conflict behavior, in which they provoke a fight with Taiwan in order to mobilize popular support and certainly distract people away from the domestic problems? So I think, I was talking with Aaron Friedberg yesterday at another event about the whole diversionary war notion. And, he said that it's one thing to have diversionary foreign policy, and you might say that some of China's overreach, like its wolf warrior diplomacy, in which it kind of picks fights with other countries, not ones that are going to lead to military conflict necessarily, but ones that kind of get people's blood boiling, that can have some domestic political utility. And we see this in our own countries, don't we? That finding a foreign target helps distract people from domestic discontents. But it's hard for me to believe that any leader, even one who makes arbitrary judgments and policy mistakes like Xi Jinping, would be so foolhardy as to actually attack Taiwan, provoke a war not just with Taiwan, but most likely with the United States, now with Japan, and other allies, that would be a positive way of handling domestic problems. You know, as you point out, it would devastate China. And in fact, if you try to make a grab for Taiwan and fail, it is widely believed inside China that that would doom any leader, that there'd be a nationalist, you know, would be, people would be infuriated by losing or not going hard enough against Taiwan, and therefore would bring down the leadership, might even bring down party rule. So the risks of going after Taiwan militarily and failing are really, in my view, what has deterred previous Chinese leaders from going after Taiwan as much or more than the military deterrence that's been put in place by Taiwan itself with the support of the United States.
So it's an internal question as much as anything. Well, let me add one last question to this section, Susan, which flows quite naturally from what you just said before we open up to Q&A, because I see that there are questions coming in from the audience. We all saw, I think we would have all seen on television, a couple of weeks ago, the meeting in Moscow between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. I was intrigued actually by the number of takes in different Western media analyzing the meeting, which seemed to all read something very different. Everything on the range from these guys had very comfortable body language, they clearly like each other, they got on well, to at least one take, which was, it was obvious that Xi Jinping was patronizing Putin and he kind of owned him lock, stock and barrel. And Putin's smile was very uneasy, whereas Xi's grin was, pretty wide. I mean, we have no idea, other than through very, very high level sources. Maybe you have better ones than I do, about what they actually said to each other in private. So a lot of this seemed to be reading body language in a slightly old fashioned sort of a way. But do you have thoughts about that meeting and the wider dynamic of the relationship and how we should interpret it and take it seriously?
Well, I was really alarmed by this particular meeting of the 40 meetings that Xi Jinping has had with Vladimir Putin over the last decade, which is a remarkable number if you think about it. Because first of all, just going to Moscow then, during a period when it appeared that Xi was trying to restore confidence in his leadership after a whole series of missteps, including the collapse of zero COVID, sudden collapse of zero COVID, trying to restore some stability in relations with the United States. Remember, Blinken was supposed to be coming, and then we had the balloon. And so this was a moment when to go, just even going to Moscow in that time frame, I think, was a kind of form of overreach. It was not judicious thing to do. And then once he got there, of course, there'd been this relatively positive action on China's part in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together, which was a huge surprise. And it was a positive diplomatic contribution to stability in the Middle East. So you would think, okay, I'm going to Moscow. I am going to go as the statesman, peace builder. And remember, they put out this pretty anodyne document about the foundation for some negotiated resolution of the Ukraine war. So maybe that's what you do. And then you emphasize that feature of the relationship between Xi and Putin. You try to persuade him to end the brutal war in Ukraine. And you depict yourself as a peace builder, but it appears that there was very little discussion of the Ukraine war. That was not the focus. And instead, it was all about this affinity between Xi and Putin as victims of Western containment, color revolutions, and everybody in the world is against us, and so we need to stick together. Well, even that I could have understood, but the final remarks when he was making his leave taking from Putin were really very alarming and so Cold War liked it to my ear. And I watched the video too, in which he said, we are seeing changes, remarkable changes that we haven't seen in more than a century. And you and I are making them happen, basically, is what he said in so many words. So that, to me, was a much more aggressive kind of stance, not just that we have to defend ourselves against the West, but you and I are remaking the world order, basically. And that, of course, makes China and Russia together seem like a much greater threat to the rest of the world, especially to the United States.
Susan, thank you. Well, you've left it there on an ominous and also intriguing note, which is perhaps a good moment for us to go to our wider discussion with the audience. And I know that, Andrew, I think you're going to be organizing this part of the discussion. Is that right?
I'm happy to moderate, or Roddy, if you're welcome to field the questions as well.
Okay, let's kick off then. There's a question from Gordon Barclay, whose comment is that stark dichotomy of more technocratic, less compliant, it seems to be scarily reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. What do you feel about that, Susan?
Oh, that's a very good point. I do feel that under Xi Jinping, professional meritocracy is much less important than what in my first book I called virtuocracy.
Right.
And which is ideological loyalty. And I think that is the case for Xi Jinping. He is willing to trade off the professional competence of officials for their ideological loyalty. And to that extent, it has some resonances of the Cultural Revolution, I agree. Although obviously it's a very different circumstance than a struggle. There are no red guards, nothing like that. Rana wanted to join in there, I think.
No.
Well, yeah, just a quick thought off the back of that. I mean, you the first point you just made there really clearly, actually, Susan, I absolutely agree that the major difference, there's actually a difference between Xi and Mao. You know, sometimes you get this question, is Xi Jinping the new Mao Zedong? And I don't think he is, for a variety of reasons. But one of them is that whatever you think about Mao, and he, you know, was someone who one has to condemn in a whole variety of areas, his interest in a sort of grassroots overturning of politics was real. It was often deeply destructive, but it was something that he really genuinely wanted to do from a very early age. You know, he was a revolutionary who wanted to throw things over. And Xi Jinping, partly I think because he grew up in the Cultural Revolution, has always been tied to the idea of order. I mean, this is one of the things that's intriguing about Susan's book and the idea of the maintenance of stability, because at one level, Xi Jinping is obsessed with stability, making sure that there are not these messy bits of society, such as civil society, making things difficult to control. And yet in some ways also he's keen to push the edges of where China can go in a way that is much more destabilizing than any of his predecessors. So I think there's to use a good Marxist word with a Chinese background, a maodun, a contradiction in what happens there. But I want to just have a quick reflection also on the red and expert issue, which is this. There comes a point when saying that the experts don't know what they're talking about, this is not just Xi Jinping, this is, could be any leader, will only get you so far, because the problem is the experts know stuff because it's been tested and has been shown, at least, in some occasions, to work. So the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward are both examples of ideological projects that felt great in the minds of their inventor, in that particular case, Mao Zedong and those around him, but they both led to economic and human disaster because actually they didn't really work in the real world. Well, I don't think we're set for that kind of overturning of society and disaster that comes with it, but I think that pushing in directions that, logically speaking, most people who look at the economics would suggest isn't going to work, can't simply be overcome by power of the will. A brief example of what I mean, the term that's been used over and over again to describe China's economic direction for the next few years is dual circulation. I think most people on this call will have heard this term. It seems to suggest that the following three things can be simultaneously maintained. Number one, that China maintains its global trade surplus, or indeed increases it. In other words, the rest of the world becoming more and more dependent on China. Number two, that China's consumers are going to have spending power released into their pockets to revitalize the domestic economy. And number three, that China will keep its capital account closed and not seek to internationalize its currency. Now, I have yet to meet any economists. I mean, all of these are perfectly plausible policies, but most economists would say that those three policies are not plausible at the same time. And you can dress it up with whatever ideological term you like, but it's very hard to see how you can maintain those elements at the same time in the world that actually exists, where China actually has to operate in a global trading system where it's very powerful, but where it can't actually sort of change the rules simply by fiat, because it simply won't come out the way that it's put in the propaganda. I think, by the way that where it will give is that China will maintain a global trade surplus in a whole variety of areas. It will keep its capital account closed, and therefore I don't think domestic consumption is going to become this great driver of growth that's being put forward, because that's the easiest one to squeeze, because the Chinese government has more control over that than anything else. So that's where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of trying to strip the economists out of the ideological framework that's being made.
Rana, thanks. Well, here's a question from Sunil Muridar for both of you. What's so unique about China's overreach? Money, power, swagger, hubris, hegemony, etc. have always gone hand in hand, from Spain and Portugal to Germany and Britain to the US to the USSR. Now it's the turn of China and possibly India. Your thoughts, please. Susan.
Well, I mean, certainly rapid economic growth and historical legacy of being an empire definitely do tend to hubristic overreach. But what's interesting is that all of these countries have had period in which they exercise self-restraint. And certainly China did. So I guess for me, I'm not contrasting China with some other well-behaving country. I'm contrasting China after 2008 with China before 2008. And I don't think it's just a matter of how powerful it was. It's not. One of the important points of my book is that I try to show how much human agency there is here, and things could have turned out differently. So I don't think it's just China's rise, the Thucydides trap, the increasing power of China that leads it to change its behavior. But it's more the dynamics of the domestic political system.
Right.
I mean, I think the thing about Overreach is that in a sense, Susan's case will be proved, or I think it may be a case where actually the author probably has a hearty wish for the case to be disproved, in a sense,
Right.
judging by the tone of it, when we actually know whether it's happened or not, because it will be overreach, a little bit like, the Great Leap Forward, if it turns out that China ends up doing itself a great disservice, and possibly the rest of the world as well, by pushing all of these elements too far. There are two alternative scenarios. One is, I think, a highly desirable one, in which the rest of the world and China learn to accommodate each other. I mean, again, Susan uses, I think, the metaphor of race or competition rather than necessarily conflict, and that, strikes me as a very reasonable way to try and provide a metaphor for what would be appropriate. The other side, of course, is that in a sense, China, like any other country, doesn't undertake policy ventures without having at least some sense that they may be successful. And if you end up with a scenario in which China's desire to create a highly authoritarian, surveillance-driven state at home, driven by, let's be frank, extraordinary innovation in technology beyond what many people would have thought, 10 to 15 years ago, in which its primary goal essentially of creating an Asia-Pacific area of economic and military strength without actually having to go into conflict, if it achieves that, then it may actually be counted as a great success and not an overreach at all from China's point of view, even though much of the rest of the world would find it very difficult to live with. I say, though, that the rest of the world, I mean, I think it's worth noting, even within Asia, we're already seeing a bit of a split in terms of where the rest of the region sees China's ambitions as being tolerable or not. Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, if we take that as a separate entity for a moment, are clearly deeply concerned about the direction that China is going. They see overreach, written in every single policy direction that China takes at the moment. Southeast Asia seems much more ambivalent. It's not that people in Indonesia or Malaysia or, the parts of the region, even those which have issues over the South China Sea, are still a little bit more lukewarm, a little bit less enthusiastic, at least in public, in saying that they want to push back against a perceived overreach. Clearly, some of this is performative, not least because they want access to China's economic power. And behind the scenes, an awful lot of them, I think, are probably saying to the United States and other powers, stay in the region, but we may not be speaking in public about that. But nonetheless, I think that China itself sees those sorts of differences in the way that other neighbors and countries beyond that talk about China, to create the idea that there are alternative discourses. And one of those discourses, perhaps with Southeast Asia and elsewhere, is that China is doing nothing out of the ordinary. There's nothing to see here, just walk past. All they're doing is, increasing their economic power, and, big powers tend to have big navies, and where's the big deal with that? So I think that question of whether or not Northeast and Southeast Asia end up in the same place over China is going to be one of the most interesting things to keep an eye on in the next 2, 5, 7 years, particularly if, as we all hope, the region stays broadly stable, but starts reshaping itself according to the new economic realities of the area.
Here's another question. What about a war or conflict with a neighboring country as a diversion? Mongolia, Laos, or even the Russian Far East, depending on the Ukraine outcome. An emerging opinion a few years back was for China to even invade or intervene in North Korea. Rather a frightening scenario. Susan.
Well, I think, one of the big questions is, will Xi Jinping be prudent in not actually undertaking any military action? And I think previous Chinese leaders have been quite prudent. China hasn't really fought a war since the war with Vietnam in 1979. So I think we worry a little bit more about Xi Jinping because he seems more unpredictable, and but I still think that, for the reasons I think we talked about a few minutes ago, it's one thing to be diversionary in your foreign policy rhetoric It's another thing to actually provoke a military conflict. So, and let's remember the Chinese military itself has been really quite prudent in not wanting to undertake any military action that they didn't feel they were sure to win. And previously, Chinese leaders would ask the PLA generals, you know, especially on Taiwan, can you guarantee to me that we'll win? And they've said, no, they can't. And so I think until the time comes that they say, yes, we can guarantee it, you're not going to see China actually undertake military action.
Rana, do you want to respond to that as we come up towards the hour? We've got a little bit of time.
Yeah, I'll leave that one for because it might time to get another question and then we can come back again with Susan. I want to let people get their voices in, so I won't say more at this point.
Let me just see. Yeah, what were the realistic alternatives to overreach and outcome to the situation in Hong Kong in 2019-2020? Local government seems paralyzed, street violence, anti-mainland sentiment, the unrealistic calls for independence, one man, one vote, and the loss of control of the narrative to some very Western-influenced anti-communist, anti-mainland viewpoint. So the Hong Kong question.
Oh, I think there were many possible alternatives in Hong Kong, and you know, many compromise positions and many different points of view among the pro-democracy camp that an artful management from Beijing might have achieved a much better result from the standpoint of Beijing, because you know, and what we see now is that that businesses, the highly educated population in Hong Kong are heading for the exits. And Hong Kong has become absorbed in China in violation of Beijing's agreements with the UK about the transition over 50 years. So it definitely has been costly to China, reinforced the image of a China threat. Clearly, the person who asked the question is kind of more sympathetic to the pro-mainlander position. There was a lot of conflict within Hong Kong between Hong Kong nationalists and mainlanders. There was violence. There were a lot of challenges, but it's hard for me to see that that the only solution was to have the party take over Hong Kong, establish a security operation in Hong Kong, which is very heavy-handed, change the educational system so it eliminates the more cosmopolitan perspectives of people in Hong Kong. The legal system is also being transformed to being more like the legal system of any Chinese city. So, you know, I think this is has been costly to China and to the people of Hong Kong, obviously.
Rana?
Yeah, I just briefly echo Susan there. I think it's clear to anyone who knows Hong Kong, I think the questioner, I have no idea the questioner is, but I suspect he does, that there are lots of people who are both pro-democratic and actually very moderate and wanting to actually find compromise in their views. There's obviously a narrative usefulness from Beijing's point of view in flagging up street violence and all sorts of things, which actually were condemned by Democrats as much as they were by the pro-Beijing parties. not stressing perhaps some of the elements which you bring up, such as the use of triads by some of the more pro-Beijing elements, like the fight in the metro station. The point being that Hong Kong could have been maintained as a place that both was inevitably, as everyone knew from 1997, drawing closer to the mainland, and that was never in dispute for the vast, even actually some of the most notable activists were not pro-independence at all. If you look at the details of what they were saying, they're very careful to actually say that they were not looking to actually separate Hong Kong from the mainland, and that's a very important point, which, you know, everyone, I think, of the major commentators looking at the situation would have agreed with too. It ended up actually, as Susan saying, being an own goal for China, because it continues to look much more like anyone who's actually, you know, critical of the Chinese government or critical of named leaders, Xi Jinping and others, essentially being told that they no longer have the right to express those views, rather than actually focusing on the relatively small and very, you know, widely condemned violence in a small number of cases. Had Beijing and Hong Kong's authorities got together to do that, they could have actually presented a narrative to the wider world that actually would have done China's image a lot of good. But for whatever reason, they chose not to go down that particular path. That was China's choice. That was Hong Kong's choice. In the end, they have the sovereignty there. But I think it's fair to say that it was a choice. It was not an inevitability at all. I fail to see, for instance, how someone like Martin Lee could be regarded as a sort of Molotov, you know, throwing dissident. After all, the poor man's like 82 or something, or Cardinal Zen. I mean, he's 90. I mean, you know, come on. Let's let's look at the specifics of what people are talking about, and then realize, of course, there are alternative pathways.
Thank you. Well, the hour is upon us, and it leaves me ready to thank both of you so much for participating in this webinar. Susan, for talking about your wonderful book, Rana, for raising some very interesting questions. I have a copy here of the book, and I'm assuming that people can buy it on Amazon or wherever, which they should certainly do. See, it's produced by the Oxford University Press, always a good thing. One of the most profitable parts of the university, as I understand it. But what an interesting discussion about a hugely important question for us all. And we still wonder about China and her role with Russia and how that will end. There's an amusing photograph circulating of Vladimir Putin cleaning Xi Jinping's shoes, which is buzzing around the world at the moment. So on a serious note, Susan, thank you so much for joining us from New York, and Rana joining us from Oxford. So to all of you and to those listening, very many thanks. And for those for whom it means something, a very happy Easter. Bye-bye, everybody.